the last 30 years, politicians in Britain have tried to build a new prosperity. They wanted to make an old nation that had fallen behind in the world recapture the glories of its past. They turned for help to what they believed was a science of money. One after another, Labour and Conservative governments became convinced that if they followed what they thought were a set of scientific laws, the economy would grow faster. The perceived tide of decline could be reversed. But instead of restoring the country's fortunes, the economic experiments failed to halt Britain's relative decline. This is the odd story of how politicians came to believe there was a technical way to make Britain great again. What was holding Britain back, it was decided, was the old-fashioned idea that the civil servant's job was simply to keep the economy stable. In 1961, the Conservative government set up NEDI, the National Economic Development Council, in what had been a gentleman's club in Westminster. It was advised by young economists convinced they could make the economy grow much faster. NEDI's economists did not have a new theory, but they believed they could use existing techniques in a new way. They saw themselves as followers of the economist Maynard Keynes. He had shown how to manage an economy by increasing or decreasing demand. The problem was that every time you increased demand too much, imports flooded in and wages rose. But NEDI's economists were convinced they could control a boom. They would plan investment in industry and the government would hold inflation down. The bad old days of stop-go would be over.
A plan for steady, continuous, controlled production and expansion.
Labour promised a national plan, run by a separate Department of Economic Affairs under George Brown. It would make Britain grow by a quarter in just 6 years. It was a seductive dream for a socialist party, for if the economists could produce this growth, then Labour's leaders would avoid what they had always thought inevitable, the battle to redistribute the country's wealth. Instead, there would be more for everyone. But it all depended on the economists' promises that they had the technical solutions to the politicians' problems.
The fight for the pound is on. After last week's depressing trade figures and the rise in the bank rate, after a weekend of growing speculation and 3 days of shoring up the pound in the foreign exchange market, Mr. Harold Wilson himself cried stop.
What went wrong was that foreigners who held the pound decided in unison that Britain was no longer to be trusted. There was a wave, there was a mood. And what the government has done is to respond to the mood by producing something which demonstrates a will to deflate this economy, which is bound to crush it, in my view. In other words, we're condemned to no growth.
The attempt to plan growth had failed. Britain was left with little expansion and political disaster. Most economists blamed it on the government's failure to devalue. Few asked whether the weakness of Britain's currency was really a symptom of something much deeper, far beyond the power of their techniques to deal with. A year later, the government bowed to the inevitable and devalued. But it was far too late. The economy had long ago come juddering to a stop.
As a result of that experience, we had to abandon the notion, tacitly and slowly, but abandon it all the same, that the planning apparatus itself was the unique and certain method of achieving the aim of faster growth. We still believed in faster growth, and we still, many of us, thought that it was attainable, but this particular path to its achievement was no longer key, was no longer essential, could no longer be relied upon.
In the early 70s, many economists began to find they no longer understood how money behaved. The new Conservative government under Edward Heath had tried what was called a dash for growth. They poured in money by liberalising credit and increasing public spending. For a moment, the economy boomed. But then the strangest thing happened. Prices and unemployment began to rise together. People called it stagflation.
All a girl needs.
30p for a deck chair this week. Blimey, it was only 15p last week. This inflation's killing me.
Now, I happened to arrive in the Treasury in 1970. When I got there, people really felt that they didn't quite understand how the economy worked anymore. And one particular example of this was that we saw unemployment and inflation rising at the same time. And that was something that should have been quite impossible. While this was going on, there sitting in Chicago in the States were the monetarists who said, no, we know perfectly well what's going on. We can explain it. You've been led astray by your Keynesian beliefs, and we can explain precisely what's going on, and it's all to do with the growth of the money supply.
I and people who believe the way that we did were saying that a continuation of the policies was going to lead to higher inflation and more